What if the money didn't disappear because you spent it wrong, but because the rules quietly shifted after you stopped paying attention? What if retirement didn't suddenly fail, but slowly changed shape while everything around it looked familiar enough to feel safe? And what if the most dangerous part wasn't losing money at all, but never noticing the exact moment when control slipped out of your hands? At first, there was nothing dramatic. No crash, no warning, no single day you could circle on a calendar and say, "This is when it broke." There was no siren, no emergency broadcast, no reason to panic. Just a sequence of small, technical adjustments that felt harmless when taken one by one. A letter arrived with updated figures, a projection softened slightly, a contribution limit moved by a narrow margin, a benefit estimate adjusted its tone. Each change appeared reasonable in isolation. None of them demanded immediate action. None of them felt personal, and that was precisely why they worked. For most of his working life, the structure had felt solid: work hard, save consistently, delay gratification, trust the framework. Retirement was supposed to be the quiet reward waiting at the end of discipline, the promise that patience would eventually turn into freedom. But discipline only works when the destination stays fixed. At first, he blamed himself. Maybe he had started too late. Maybe he misunderstood the rules. Maybe he wasn't aggressive enough or cautious enough or informed enough. That instinct to internalize failure felt natural, almost comforting. Because questioning yourself is easier than questioning a system you were trained to trust. He ran the numbers again, then again, and again. Each time the result landed in the same narrow range, technically acceptable, stable, survivable, but never expansive, never liberating, enough to exist without panic, not enough to move without fear, enough stability, not enough agency. That was when the pattern began to surface. Every adjustment, when viewed over time, moved in the same direction. Not sharply, not dramatically, just consistently. Taxes didn't spike, they crept. Benefits didn't disappear, they diluted. Inflation didn't explode, it eroded. Each change could be defended on its own, explained away, rationalized. But together they formed a corridor. You could still walk forward. You could still step back. But the walls closed in so slowly that most people adapted without ever realizing they were adapting. And adaptation feels like wisdom. That realization changed the way he saw everything. The system didn't need to break people. It didn't need fear, anger, or visible resistance. It only needed calm. Calm workers don't revolt. Calm savers don't question assumptions. Calm retirees accept trade-offs as inevitability rather than design. The promise was never abundance. It was predictability. The word security appeared everywhere. Financial security, retirement security, income security. The word sounds protective, reassuring, but security is also containment. It's a boundary disguised as comfort. The more closely he looked, the clearer it became. Default options everywhere. Automatic enrollment, suggested contribution rates, target date structures with names that implied safety and inevitability. All of it helpful, all of it reasonable, all of it quietly shaping behavior. Choice still existed, but it was framed, and framed choices feel voluntary even when the outcome has already been anticipated. He began to understand why so many people reached retirement confused rather than angry. Anger requires contrast. Confusion feels personal. The system didn't collapse, it normalized. He thought about conversations he'd had over the years. Intelligent people, disciplined people, people who followed the rules. They all said the same things in different words. "I thought I'd have more. I don't know where it went. I guess this is just how it is." Acceptance masquerading as maturity. And then the most dangerous realization surfaced. The system wasn't designed to maximize freedom. It was designed to minimize volatility. Freedom creates unpredictability. Unpredictability creates pressure. Pressure forces change. So the system smooths outcomes, dampens extremes, keeps everything just stable enough to function without disruption. Not generous, not cruel, efficient. Complexity played its role perfectly. Layers of rules, exceptions buried in footnotes. Timelines that only made sense if you tracked them for decades. You could learn them technically, but only if you dedicated time most people no longer had. Complexity doesn't eliminate resistance, it exhausts it. By the time you understand what's happening, you're too tired to fight it. And fighting isn't encouraged anyway. The language is always polite. Adjustments, optimizations, long-term sustainability, never loss, never extraction, never transfer. But value doesn't vanish. It moves. The question was never whether money was disappearing. The real question was where it was being redirected and under what assumptions. That thought stayed with him. If stability for the system requires reduced flexibility for individuals, who absorbs the difference? Who pays for calm? He began to see retirement not as an endpoint but as a handoff. From personal control to institutional management, from flexibility to dependency, not dramatic dependency, quiet dependency, dependence on rules you don't shape, timelines you didn't choose, assumptions that may no longer reflect reality. And once you enter that phase, exiting becomes expensive. Penalties, taxes, opportunity cost. The walls of the corridor only become visible after the doors close. That's why most people don't panic. They adjust. They downsize expectations. They redefine comfort. They tell themselves they're fortunate. Gratitude becomes the coping mechanism. But gratitude can coexist with loss, especially when the loss is slow and socially normalized. He noticed how often responsibility was emphasized without power. You're responsible for saving, responsible for planning, responsible for adjusting expectations, but rarely empowered to question the structure shaping those outcomes. Responsibility without agency is a quiet burden. The numbers still worked, on paper, but something fundamental had shifted. Retirement no longer felt like freedom delayed. It felt like managed stability. And managed stability always has a cost, not always in dollars, often in agency. He didn't feel rage. He felt something subtler, reduced. Like a variable inside someone else's model. The system didn't need his enthusiasm. It needed compliance, predictable behavior, low variance. That was when he realized why the most fragile moment wasn't retirement itself. It was the years just before it. The moment when people are too invested to walk away but still aware enough to sense something is off. That's when the system needs them calm the most. Not desperate. Desperation creates noise. Calm creates order. He closed the document and sat still, not because he had answers but because he finally understood the shape of the problem. The system didn't fail. It performed exactly as designed. The real question wasn't how to fix it. The real question was quiet. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the part no one warns you about. Understanding the system doesn't make you freer. It makes you aware of how narrow your remaining moves are. Awareness is not relief. Awareness is friction. Because now every decision carries weight. Every choice feels like it's being measured against rules you didn't write. He started noticing it in small moments. A conversation about retirement plans would suddenly stall. Someone would change the subject, joke it away, say something like, "At least we'll be okay." Okay became the goal. Not independent, not flexible, just okay. The system didn't reward curiosity, it rewarded acceptance. The more he spoke carefully, the easier life felt. The more he questioned out loud, the more resistance appeared, not as confrontation but as delay. Extra steps, more paperwork, longer timelines, polite obstacles, nothing aggressive. Nothing you could point to and accuse, just enough friction to teach you a lesson. And the lesson was simple. Staying inside the lines is easier. That's how most people learn compliance, not through fear but through exhaustion. He realized that the system doesn't block exits, it prices them. Every alternative path had a cost attached. Taxes, penalties, lost benefits, uncertainty. Stability was subsidized. Change was expensive, so people stayed. Not because they were stupid, Not because they were lazy, because the math punished movement. And punishment doesn't need cruelty to be effective. It only needs consistency. He noticed something else too. The language people used when they talked about money had changed. They didn't say, "I want." They said, "I should." They didn't say, "I choose." They said, "It makes sense." Desire had been replaced by justification. That's when he understood something darker. The system wasn't just managing money. It was managing emotion. Fear was reduced. Hope was muted. Expectation was flattened. The result wasn't misery, it was numbness. And numb people don't rebel. They adjust. Retirement planning became a ritual, not a dream, a checklist, a compliance exercise. Fill this, delay that, wait. Waiting became the default action, and waiting feels responsible. But waiting also hands control to whoever sets the clock. He started to see retirement less as a destination and more as a holding pattern. You slow down. You narrow options. You accept boundaries. Not because you're told to, but because every alternative feels reckless. The system didn't forbid freedom. It reframed it as risk. Risk became something irresponsible people took, people who didn't plan, people who didn't understand consequences. So responsibility became synonymous with obedience. He thought about how often uncertainty was portrayed as danger. Markets fluctuate, rules change, plans fail. Better to stay put. Better to trust the structure. That message was everywhere, and it worked, because humans prefer certainty, even unfavorable certainty, over ambiguity. The system knew this. It relied on it. That's why exit is so difficult after awareness. Once you see the leash, you also see the fence. And beyond the fence is not chaos, but ambiguity. And ambiguity feels like standing without a map. He realized something else that unsettled him. The system didn't care if you understood it. Understanding didn't threaten it. Action did. And action required energy most people no longer had by the time they noticed the problem. That's the real timing advantage. By the time you ask the right questions, you're already tired. Tired from decades of compliance. Tired from carrying responsibility without leverage. Tired from adjusting expectations downward again and again. So the system doesn't rush you. It waits. Waiting favors institutions, not individuals. He noticed how often people near retirement described their situation with a kind of resigned humor. Well, that's life. It could be worse. At least we're healthy. Health became the last remaining currency. Everything else had been quietly converted into trade-offs. He wondered how many people reached the end believing they failed, when in reality they followed instructions perfectly. That thought stayed with him, because systems that rely on self-blame are extremely stable. If you blame yourself, you won't blame the structure. And if you won't blame the structure, you won't try to change it. The system doesn't need defenders. It needs silence. That's when he realized why conversations about retirement often feel strangely hollow. There's no language for disappointment without shame. If you say you're unhappy, you sound ungrateful. If you say you're confused, you sound uninformed. So people stay quiet. And quiet systems last a long time. He also noticed something else. The people who benefited most from the system rarely talked about it. Their security didn't come from compliance. It came from flexibility, options, timing, access. They didn't wait, they moved. But their paths weren't advertised. Those paths required information, leverage, and early positioning. By the time most people became aware, those doors were already behind them. Not locked, just distant. Distance can be as effective as a wall. He realized then that the system had two layers, one for optimization, one for participation. Most people were participants. A small group were optimizers, and the rules were written to keep those groups from overlapping too often. Participation required trust. Optimization required skepticism. Trust was encouraged. Skepticism was framed as anxiety. So most people chose peace over precision. That choice felt human. That's why the system worked. He understood now why financial stability feels comforting but incomplete. It gives you safety without sovereignty. You're protected, but not in control. And control is what humans mistake for greed until they lose it. He sat with that thought, not angry, not panicked, just clear, clear enough to understand that nothing would change overnight, clear enough to know that the system didn't need villains to function. It only needed patience. The kind of patience that outlasts attention. The kind of patience institutions have, and individuals don't. That's when the final layer of the problem revealed itself. Leaving the system isn't hard because it's forbidden. It's hard because it asks you to tolerate discomfort again, uncertainty, imperfect plans, unclear outcomes, things modern systems are designed to eliminate, so most people stay, not trapped, settled. And settlement looks peaceful from the outside, but peace without agency slowly turns into quiet despair, not loud enough to disrupt anything, just enough to be lived with. He didn't know what the solution was. But he knew one thing with certainty. The system would never announce when stability crossed into control. It would always feel reasonable, polite, manageable. At first, nothing happens. That's the part that surprises people the most. When enough people begin to notice, there is no alarm, no announcement, no visible shift. The system doesn't react to awareness. It reacts to behavior. As long as noticing stays private, everything continues as normal. People read more, they think more. They talk quietly, usually at night, usually with people they trust. They compare notes. Do your numbers still make sense? Did your estimate change too? Does it feel smaller than it should? These conversations don't feel revolutionary, they feel cautious. That's because the system trained them to be. Caution looks like maturity. Restraint looks like wisdom. Silence looks like responsibility. But something subtle begins to shift. People stop assuming the rules are neutral. They stop believing outcomes are accidental. They start seeing patterns where they once saw randomness. And pattern recognition is dangerous, not because it creates chaos, but because it breaks isolation. The system is built on individual agreements, one person, one plan, one set of assumptions. When those assumptions become shared questions, the system has a problem, not a crisis, a complication. Complications slow things down. Institutions don't fear anger as much as they fear coordination. Anger burns out. Coordination compounds. That's why the system responds the way it does, not with force, with reassurance. New messaging appears, more emphasis on flexibility. More reminders that everyone's situation is different. Differences are highlighted to prevent alignment, because aligned people compare leverage, and leverage is the one thing the system can't smooth quietly. At the same time, new layers appear, more tools, more options, more complexity. Not to empower, but to diffuse focus. When there are too many paths, people stop walking. They analyze, they hesitate, they wait. Waiting returns control to whoever sets the pace. So the system adapts not to stop awareness but to slow momentum. This is where most movements stall, not because people are wrong, but because daily life reasserts itself. Bills still arrive. Jobs still demand attention. Health still matters. Awareness competes with survival, and survival usually wins. That's the quiet genius of long-term systems. They don't need to suppress truth, they just need to outlast attention. But something else happens when enough people notice. A smaller group stops asking, "What should I do?" and starts asking a different question. Why am I allowed to choose this but not that? That's the pivot point. Because that question exposes design. Design implies intention, and intention implies accountability. The system doesn't like being examined at that level. So it responds by reframing. Concern becomes anxiety. Skepticism becomes negativity. Preparation becomes obsession. People who question too openly are labeled gently. Overthinking. Paranoid. Unrealistic. The goal isn't to silence them. It's to make them doubt themselves. Self-doubt is more efficient than censorship. Most people step back at this stage, not because they're convinced, but because social friction is expensive. Nobody wants to be the difficult one, the uncomfortable one, the person who ruins dinner conversations. So awareness becomes internal again, but not for everyone. A few people continue, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. They change how they evaluate risk. They stop treating defaults as neutral. They ask where incentives actually point. They don't reject the system outright. They stop trusting it blindly, and that alone changes outcomes. Because systems optimized for predictability struggle with selective unpredictability. They can manage averages. They can't easily manage intentional deviation. This is where the real tension lives, not between people and institutions, but between design and intent. The system assumes most people want comfort, it's usually right. But when a meaningful number of people decide they want agency instead, the math changes. Not overnight, not cleanly, slowly, subtly. Just like the adjustments that created the problem in the first place. That's the irony most people miss. The same gradualism that tightens control is also the only way control loosens. No dramatic escape, no collapse. Just people making slightly different decisions for slightly different reasons over long periods of time. The system doesn't break, it recalibrates. And recalibration always reveals priorities. Who gets protected first? Who absorbs volatility? Who carries risk when stability is threatened? That's when the story stops being about retirement and starts being about power. Not power as domination, power as optionality. Who has it? Who doesn't? And why? Most people never reach this layer. Not because they're incapable, because the system doesn't reward getting here. It rewards staying comfortable. That's why the final danger isn't ignorance. It's comfort. Comfort keeps systems stable long after they stop being fair. Comfort convinces people that inconvenience is failure. Comfort teaches people to confuse peace with freedom. When enough people notice, nothing explodes. Something far more unsettling happens. The system begins to show its shape. And once you see the shape, you can't pretend it's natural. You can live inside it. You can work around it. But you can't unknow it. That knowledge doesn't make you heroic. It makes you responsible. Responsible for how much comfort you're willing to trade for control.